This is definitely going to be one of my edgiest videos, so appropriately I'm wearing my edgy Halloween shirt in February. Let that bake your noodle. Or maybe don't. Sometimes a pun is just a pun. Some people really have to overanalyze everything. It's kind of weird, right? Alright, so edges and sharpness. Something that many people may be interested in, not just sword nerds, also knife geeks, chefs, various craftsmen, etc. And some people get downright obsessive over which is the sharpest sword ever and why sharpness is the best thing since sliced bread. I've often mentioned and oversimplified it in blade reviews. If you're looking for a quick and dirty general rule of thumb, it's a sharper blade will be damaged more easily, a more durable blade won't cut as well, and same goes for a thin versus a thick blade. But there's a lot more complexity to it, and here's what I'm going to turn into this guy. Alright, let's start at the beginning with the very basics. Simple freehand drawn sketch here. So you start out with a flat metal bar, right? And then you remove metal, you grind it until eventually you come up with something like this. So you grind it until the two surfaces of the blade meet, like that. This right here, all of this material that you've removed, the surface that you've created, that's the primary bevel. And it can be done in a number of ways. It can be done as a flat grind, meaning that, let's say you have a single edge blade, you start from the spine, at some point, let's say it's flat here for a little bit, and then you grind it to where the surfaces meet, and this is all you have, single bevel. Well, technically this is a double bevel because a single bevel would be this, also called a chisel grind. You can also have a primary bevel and then a secondary bevel at the end. And to complicate things more, you can also have a primary bevel and then a micro bevel all the way at the end. So what's all that about? Why even have different types of grind? Well, they all have their pros and cons. What is the absolute sharpest edge you can possibly have? This, basically. So in case of a double-edged blade, so this is the cross-section in case you haven't noticed yet. So you have a little bit of flat surface here, which is the original thickness of the bar of the blade, and then you grind it all the way evenly until those two surfaces meet and apex. And this is going to be extremely sharp and going to cut extremely well. Even more extreme if instead of a double-edged blade, you take the same blade width and make it single-edged. This is how much taper you have. So, meaning that over longer distance, the more you taper it, the thinner and thinner and thinner it gets. So whenever people talk about a razor sharp edge, here's the deal. A razor has a hollow ground edge. So meaning it's concave. So that means compared to a flat grind, you're actually tapering more aggressively because you're dipping in, you're removing even more material there, and now you get this really thin waver. For a razor, that's desirable. You want the sharpest, thinnest edge, so you just cleanly cut the hair. You don't get much resistance, it doesn't drag around on the skin, and there's also other reasons. The more aggressively you grind that hollow shape, the lighter and more flexible the razor is going to be. So a sword with a thin but wide blade that tapers all the way from the spine to the edge would be absurdly sharp, and basically it would be ruined the first time you cut anything with it, because you have so little material supporting the edge here. It would, if it's relatively soft, it would roll. You would get edge rolling, or worse, it would just break. Why does it cut better? Well, because it concentrates the force that you put into the cut on a smaller surface. So there's two aspects to this. One is the edge itself, the apex, so the point where those two surfaces of the blade meet. This is never going to be zero. It can't be. So there's always going to be just a little bit of space at the end. You know, if you look at it microscopically, the edge has a certain thickness. And so the sharper you want the edge, the more you would grind it to the point where this space in between the two surfaces is as small as it can get. Now, sometimes in sci-fi settings you have monomolecular blades, and that's the ultimate basically in theory. If you had an edge that was just like a single molecule thick at the apex, it would be the ultimate. Cannot get any sharper than that. The only problem is, because it's a single molecule, it would be so fragile that you need either magic or some kind of super advanced sci-fi tech, i.e. space magic, to somehow give it all the extra strength that the material itself, or basically lack thereof, can provide. So if you had something that was monomolecular, the first time you encounter anything you want to cut, you would immediately destroy that single molecule, or, well, not destroy, you would displace it, basically. And this is how an edge dulls to begin with. If you have the super thin wafer-like edge and you cut material with it, there's going to be abrasion, there's going to be forces acting on that. So either this eventually turns into this. Okay, I've changed the thickness, but you get the idea. Just because, abrasion rounds it off, or it simply breaks off with use. And then you're left with, again, more distance between the two surfaces. And that sharpness is what you can feel. Any kind of test you can do, a hair shaving or the thumbnail test or whatever, all of those basically test how much space is between those two surfaces. Or put in a different way, what's the radius of the edge, basically. And what that edge sharpness does is it gets the cut started. It penetrates the surface. Every surface has a certain amount of hardness and toughness and surface tension, etc. So you need the initial sharpness to get it started, and then you can widen this cut, basically. You can then push the blade through when the edge has already opened up the material. How much you need, that depends on the radius of the edge. So with a thicker edge that has more space in between, you can still do a cut. It just requires more force. So let's say a blunt blade like this. There's a lot of space in between those surfaces. It's not a very acute angle. And so this generally doesn't cut. However, if you were to apply enough force, if a superhero or a robot were to strike something with, say, 100 times more force than a normal human cut, then yeah, this will still separate material. Of course, this will still cut you in half if there's enough force behind it. And that's an issue whenever you see a blade being deflected by fabric, be it just clothing or cloth armor, like a padded jack or a gambeson, for example. If the edge itself is a little too thick and rounded, it it doesn't bite in, it doesn't get any purchase on it. So it cannot start the cut because the material is too tough. So instead of biting in, the force still needs to go somewhere. So either it'll bounce straight back, or more likely, because it's not a perfectly flat surface, it's much more likely to glance off. But sharpness in and of itself is not where it ends, because there's a noticeable difference between a thin blade and a thick one. You can have a pretty thick blade with a properly honed edge at a fairly obtuse angle that still cuts reasonably well. Some tools have a very steep angle, but they're still precisely enough ground and polished that this is a sharp corner. You know, on a microscopic level, this corner, instead of being like this, basically is more like this. You know, chisels can be at varying angles, but basically like that. Let's imagine this was a perfectly even cube. You know, all the surfaces are at a nice 90-degree sharp angle, and it's all very precisely shaped. These corners would be pretty sharp. If I take this perfect cube and drag it across my skin, it'll cut. However, if I take the same cube and try to push it into something, you know, if I try to bash someone with that, this will not penetrate very far. Simply because as you push in, there's more and more material, it gets thicker and thicker, the angle gets more and more extreme, so there's more resistance. There's basically more push against the sides. It binds up. This is basically the difference between a graceful athlete leaping into the water, forming a wedge with the hands, and the old belly splash. It's just much more surface area. But again, with enough force, if for example a T-800 Terminator jammed this into your chest, full force, he would probably split you in half. I found some interesting experiments on this exact topic where they tested a 20-degree angle edge versus a 50-degree angle, and they found that the thinner blade would dull more quickly than the thicker one, but it would still cut better. So what's happening here is because there's less material behind that apex, it can be worn off or break off, etc. more easily, whereas the more obtuse angle just supports it better. It'll take longer to grind it down, you can't deform or break it as easily, but there's still so much less resistance in that thinner blade that even though the edge itself on a microscopic level is thicker, there's still less resistance as it goes through the material. Keep in mind that was a push cut. A slicing cut adds a different dimension. So at that point you can argue whether a toothier edge, meaning one that you haven't polished at quite as high of a grit, it's not as fine, so on a microscopic level you have little irregularities and little jaggies, so to speak, serrations essentially. You could argue that that will do better with a slicing cut as opposed to a highly polished edge that's much more even. That might do better with a cleave or a hew or a less slicing dominated cut. And I say less slicing dominated because even with a straight blade, it's never this. You don't fight like that. You don't walk up to somebody and, you know, push the blade against them. Of course, it makes a difference whether you draw the blade in and give it much more of a pronounced slice as opposed to doing more of a hew, basically. But either way, because there's an arc to the swing, it'll still slice to an extent. So like I said before, this would be the sharpest possible blade and also very fragile. And this would be the most durable. So you can give it a convex grind. So basically, instead of just making it a hard angle, you make it a smooth transition here. Very durable. It dissipates the force better along a curve as opposed to a straight line. And so this is an extremely durable type, especially if you make it this short. You know, if you make it short and thick and rounded that much, it's almost indestructible, but it's just not going to cut all that well. I have an example of that in the video where somebody asked me to destroy a cheapo katana that he sent in. You have a very obvious, pronounced convex grind on that. So you can chop into bone, no problem, and it can still be quite sharp. You can absolutely have a relatively thick blade with a remarkably sturdy edge that's still sharp. But on a sword, it's not going to penetrate as well as a thinner blade because there's just more resistance, it requires more force. Here's basically the opposite example of that. This thing is scary sharp. For one, it's very thin. It's a pretty wide blade when it's already thin here, and then it gets even thinner toward the edge. And then the edge itself is very sharp. You can feel that immediately. So this thing cuts absurdly well. But I'm sure you can also see the problem here. It's damaged much more easily. There's quite a bit of damage here, and I have not used this very hard. But because it gets so thin, there's just so much potential for edge rolling, chipping, you know, nicks. Here's another example. This is a more durable edge. This is somewhat convex at the end. It still gets fairly thin, but not crazy thin. But the entire thing is rather thin. And this is just, you have flat surface all the way up to that grind, and then it tapers here. But it doesn't have to go far because it's already fairly thin. So the thinner blade will penetrate more deeply because there's just less resistance. It can kind of split the material more easily. But because it's pretty wide, you add mass to it. So this has a certain amount of heft, so that mass adds to the force that you deliver with the swing, and this hits pretty hard, and it's quite a good tool. Here's an example of an extremely robust blade. So you can see it is very thick. See the spine here. There's the primary bevel. So it's a fairly wide bevel. In other words, it tapers a good deal, which you need to get from this thick spine to a workable edge. You have to taper it quite a bit, but then it also has a secondary bevel at the end. So that gives it more strength because behind the start of the secondary bevel, you still have more material. It's still thicker. And then the secondary bevel forms the actual cutting edge. This is still quite sharp because it did a good job of apexing those two surfaces, so there isn't that much space in between here. The angle is steeper, of course, than what I showed you before, but overall you just have that much more material, and so this won't get damaged very easily. This sword here is somewhat in between. As you can see, it's a rather narrow blade, and it's not terribly thick. It starts to taper from here. Basically where that black line is, that's about where the primary bevel starts, and then it has a secondary bevel at the end, which is blended very well. Sometimes you can't really see secondary bevels very well because they polish it a lot to blend it in, which is not just aesthetic, but also helps with the cutting. Because the more you blend that in, the less resistance it's going to meet. If you think about this, as it enters material, you know, let's say it's up to about here, these shoulders can drag a lot more as you push it through the material. If you instead blend them more like this, you can imagine it glides better, basically. I keep finding opportunities to use these two for visual reference, even though I still haven't finished the review. But yeah, they sum up quite a lot. So this one here is double-edged and a fairly thin blade. So as you can see from the center here, this is where it tapers. You have a primary bevel, then the secondary bevel forms the edge, and the edge is quite sharp. This is a pretty durable blade overall, but then if you compare it to this, it really can compete with it, because this is basically a little bit wider than the other one, but since it only has one edge, it can taper all the way from here to the edge, but it's nice and gradual. And then at the end, you have just that edge bevel here. So it still has a certain amount of thickness behind the edge, but with the way it's done here, it's a pretty smooth transition up to the secondary bevel. And the secondary bevel is not extremely hard. I mean, you can definitely feel it. So that does introduce some resistance compared to a different type, but this still cuts quite well. And in the test I did, this did way better. You know, edge on edge, this is much more durable than that. I've repaired the edge damage on this. If you haven't seen the video yet, I'll link it down below. And this, basically, I haven't even done anything to it. I did a couple of strokes with a file and really not much. I've had to do a lot more repair on this. And so this is quite a bit more durable. I think nowadays, as collectors of reproduction swords, we're a little more biased towards this because we cut tatami mats. They benefit very much from a thin blade with very sharp edge. The thinner and sharper, the better. But in historical combat, a blade like this would probably get wrecked. There would probably be a lot of damage very quickly. And so I think this is also where the confusion comes from. People think medieval European swords were dull because they need to withstand, you know, clashing against armor and shields and other weapons, etc., etc. But they can still be sharp. That's the thing. Like, you can have a sturdier edge because it has more material supporting it and it doesn't taper quite as aggressively, but you can still try to make sure that there's as little gap as possible between the two blade surfaces. So basically we're talking super thin and sharp, not very durable, very thin, relatively dull, decent cutter, thick and dull, durable, but a horrible cutter, thick and sharp, durable, and a good cutter. And of course, it also depends on the application. For example, in unarmored civilian dueling, where all you encounter is clothing, this would do fantastic, aside from the problems of damage whenever you parry and things like that. Anyway, this probably turned out pretty long. I try to avoid repeating myself, but I may have done it every now and then just to kind of drive home the point, because there's a lot of confusion on this topic, and I hope this helps to clear some things up. Either way, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and stay sharp.